Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the last day of the summit, which I'm now describing as homecoming without the football game. It's been so great to see everyone, and thank you for all of you who came today. I'm delighted to be joined by Abraham Tachjian, Canada's open banking lead. Abraham was appointed in March of 2022 with the mandate of developing a Made in Canada regime for open banking. Welcome, Abraham, and thank you for being here today with us.
Thank you for having me, Tracy. It's an honor and a privilege to be here with you today.
Thank you. Okay, so your mandate is to develop a Made in Canada regime. And this is a term that many people bring up when they're talking about the development of our open banking system in Canada. Mm-hmm. Could you describe what Made in Canada means to you?
Yeah, great way to get us started, Tracy. Made in Canada means a system that addresses the unique makeup of our country. Now, there's a couple of elements that I'd like to unpack with respect to that. And the first one being the distribution of powers between federal and provincial jurisdictions. As you know, banks are under federal jurisdiction, whereas credit unions fall under provincial jurisdictions. So Made in Canada means having a system that is inclusive of all Canadians and does not exclude anyone from a federally designed open banking system because of the mere fact that their financial relationship is with a credit union. So the first important point of what Made in Canada means. The second element is with respect to existing frameworks. Well, Tracy, when I took this job, I made it clear that I wanted to avoid making this an academic exercise. I wanted to be as pragmatic as possible, and to the extent there's already anything out there that we can copy-paste, I would be happy to do it. If plagiarism works for tech, it can work for Abraham Tachjian. So to that effect, the best example I have when we talk about existing frameworks is with respect to governance, right? When you start putting together all the elements that fit into the responsibilities of a governance structure, you start to see that we already have some of that foundation here in Canada. And the clearest example is a topic that keeps coming up, something I heard during the sessions this week, as well as in my conversation with stakeholders with respect to consumer protection, consumer education, financial literacy. Well, those are responsibilities that are already taken up by the FCAC, an existing agency. So Made in Canada implies that we're not creating a system with duplicative requirements or conflicting ones as well. And by a similar tone, there's also alignment with existing government initiatives. You heard Ron Morrow speak yesterday about the Retail Payment Activities Act. There's a modernization of our privacy legislation that is making its way through Parliament with C-27 that will enshrine an individual's right to data portability. So Made in Canada, again, by this same token, implies having a system that is not creating conflicting requirements. Then also there's this matter of the policy objectives that underpin our system. Compared to other jurisdictions, we're not trying to take punitive measures to address market behavior, something you've seen in the UK and Australia, which may have been the genesis of their systems. We don't have that here. Of course, we're trying to encourage competition with the system, but at the core of our mission is the consumer, to increase their financial welfare. So we start from that perspective, from a policy perspective. So when you wrap this all in together, what does this mean from a Made in Canada perspective? Well, it's clear that the government will have to take an active role in the system because individual organizations are not best placed to address these elements which make up our Made in Canada regime. And, Tracy, if data is currency, well, the government's always had a hand in currency. So.
Excellent. Could I ask, just for clarification, and you can appreciate that open banking is a big hallway topic at this conference, could you talk about the scope of what you're looking at? I know in some of the jurisdictions that you mentioned, it also includes payment initiation. And so if you could just provide an overview of the scope of your activities, that would be helpful.
Of course. So I've taken the advisory committee's report as the roadmap for the work that we're doing. And in the report, the suggestion was for the scope to be limited, to be phased, in the sense that we will start with data only and eventually move on to other capabilities. So what does that mean from a data perspective? Well, we'll have a system that will capture retail and SME accounts with respect to checking, lending, investment accounts, KYC information about your consumers, as well as product data. That's the scope that was outlined in the advisory committee report, and that's the scope that we'll design a system around as an initial phase, right? What we've seen in certain jurisdictions is that a phased approach is the best way to start kind of iron out the details of a system and then expand. And the best example of that is Australia.
Okay, that's a very helpful answer, thank you. So my next question for you is what you feel the risks are if Canada does not move forward with open banking?
Again, there's a couple of angles here. First, from the consumer perspective, we run the risk of not giving consumers complete control over their data as well as the financial tools to make sense of it. Instead, the control would rest with organizations that have their data. The other risk is from a global perspective, from an international competitive perspective, in the sense that we run the risk of falling behind our peers. Look, some of you may be aware that the US, after many years of what's typically termed as an industry-led model, has made an about-face in the sense that the CFPB is intending to have regulation around open banking with a target date of next year. And if that happens, we could potentially be the only G7 country without an open banking system, right? Let that sink in terms of global competitiveness and risks associated with that. Now, more domestically, I think we run also the risk of not giving the proper tools to certain smaller financial institutions to be able to better compete with their larger peers, to address this information asymmetry that exists between larger and smaller organizations. So of course, I'm talking about the competitiveness of our financial sector. And on that same note, I think we would be doing a huge disservice to our local fintech champions, which would probably run into a ceiling in terms of growth without being able to rely on data for their products and services. So the last bit I have in terms of risk, I would say from a policy perspective, we wouldn't be taking those first steps towards growing Canada's economy towards a data-based economy, in the sense that you can view open banking as the first steps towards that data sharing economy. Without it, we run the risk of leaving data sharing to small groups led by bilateral agreements, which are completely unscalable from an economy perspective, and unfit for purpose, to be frank.
Okay, thank you. So it's been a bit of a wild ride the last month or so in the economy, and I'm wondering, are there any concerns about moving forward with open banking right now? Is it the right time?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, I'm going to channel my internal Chandler Bing from Friends here by saying that there couldn't be a better time for open banking. And again, I look at this from a couple of perspectives. As the economic environment continues to put pressure on everyday Canadians, I think open banking will provide them with the right tools to kind of offset that, to help them with their financial planning, to help them better save for their future, to shop around for new financial products, and just generally increase their financial well-being. So I find open banking to be a very good tool to offset those pressures. I also look at the industry sentiment. Look, I think a couple of years ago, if you had a conversation with stakeholders around open banking, the common theme would be one of doom and gloom and all the ways open banking is going to ruin the financial system. But I think with better understanding of what comes with open banking, what I've noticed in the engagement with stakeholders is that that sentiment has shifted from one of that doom of gloom to opportunity, to how they can leverage it for their businesses and to serve their consumers. So I think there's this mental readiness around it in terms of properly capturing the opportunities. And look, similarly, from a technical readiness perspective, look, sure, other jurisdictions have beaten us to the punch, while we've been researching, consulting, discussing, fair enough. But I would suggest that nobody's got it right until this day. They've released new systems, they've iterated, and they've improved. I think the benefit to us is that we can import that to Canada. We can see what's worked well, what hasn't. And it's something that the team and I at the Department of Finance focus a lot on. We spend a lot of time speaking to our counterparts in other jurisdictions to learn just this in terms of what we can import here. And I think there's readiness from the industry perspective in the sense that they see what's going on in other jurisdictions and they're preparing their offerings in response. So when we go to turn that key on, it's not going to be completely alien in the sense that the market's been preparing for this from a product proposition perspective, as well as mentally to be more comfortable with this. Now, as you mentioned in your question, I think I would be remiss if I don't acknowledge the financial tremors that we felt over the last couple of months with certain financial institutions failing. But I would caution you against making the association between the causes of the risks that led to the collapse of certain financial institutions, be it credit risk, liquidity risk, and interest risk, with open banking. The risks that exist in open banking are materially different than those, and it's risks that we're paying attention to as we built the system. In fact, we've got a working group dedicated exclusively to this, to be focused on how we can address the risks associated with the system.
Thank you. So you mentioned you've got lots of committees and discussions, and I know you've been doing a great deal of consultation about open banking, and you've probably met with everybody in the room since you started in your role. But I'm curious, as you have your conversations with different types of stakeholders, you've talked about fintechs, large banks, are you finding that there is alignment in their views, alignment in their objectives and their desires for open banking? Are there any key takeaways that you can share with us on the QT about the discussions that you're having?
Yeah, you're right, Tracey. I've met a lot of people in person, which is very refreshing here today. I remember when we did this last year, I was sharing a room with my kids' Peppa Pig toys, so it's very refreshing to be doing this in person. Look, let me take a step back and shed some light a bit on the work we've done in engaging the industry. When I took the role, we set up 4 working groups to focus on specific pillars related to open banking. And those were accreditation. What are the requirements that you will have to fulfill to access the system? We looked at privacy requirements. Essentially, how do you manage consent as a consumer? How do you give that consent? What does that look like in a customer journey? And importantly, how you revoke that consent. We looked at liability requirements, everybody's favorite topic. Who's on the hook for what when something inevitably goes wrong? And finally, as I mentioned, we looked at security requirements. What are the security requirements from an information security perspective or a cybersecurity perspective that you will have to fulfill to have access to the system? So we've had multiple meetings in each one of those working groups. In fact, we just wrapped them up, thankfully. And in parallel to those, we've had steering committee meetings where we've brought everybody together to have a discussion on updates on how this is progressing, as well as I mentioned earlier, a lot of discussions with our counterparts in other jurisdictions. So we'll distill all of this into a framework that will take all these views into consideration. And now going back to your question, I think the one thing I've really noticed that stuck out to me is that throughout these conversations, there's a lot of consensus among the industry on how to address certain key topics, which again goes back to what I was mentioning in the sense that the sentiment around open banking among stakeholders has moved from this doom and gloom to, okay, how can we move forward? How do we address these risks? And how are we all as a system comfortable with it? So I think there's a lot of consensus among these participants. That's not to say it's perfect, right? You're in a virtual room with competing interests, so the conversations get lively occasionally. And I think one area where we still don't have 100% consensus on is with respect to governance, right? How are you going to be overseeing this system? And I think it's a topic that also came up in our second round of consultations a couple of years ago, and the sentiment still remains in the sense that certain stakeholders would prefer an industry-driven model, whereas others prefer a purely regulatory one. But I think this lack of agreement on this key point further strengthens what I was saying earlier in the sense that the government will have to take an active role in this Made in Canada system to address these points.
Great, thank you. I have one more question for you. When?
Yeah. I suspect it was coming. Look, Tracey, as I mentioned, we just wrapped up our working groups. There's a couple of months left in my mandate. Between then and now, we intend to go back to the entirety of the participants in our working groups at our steering committee discussions to give updates as to what the system will look like. I'm on track with my recommendations to be presented to the government for the government to present an open banking framework this year. So we continue to do our work, and we'll be continuing to engage the industry to that end.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you for sharing your expertise and being so amenable to answering my questions. It's been an absolute pleasure to have the conversation.
My pleasure.
And very, very helpful for the audience.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.